an excellent proof of the pitiable state of sculpture today is the fact that James Pradier is its king. Now, admittedly, this artist knows how to do flesh, and he has his particular refinements of the chisel. But he has neither the imagination necessary for great compositions, nor the graphic imagination. His talent is cold and academic. He has spent his life fattening up a small stock of antique torsos and equipping them with the coiffures of kept women. His poésie légère seems all the colder as it is the more mannered. His execution is not as opulent as in the sculptor's former works, and seen from behind, it's hideous. Now these kind words come from this charming man, the author, poet, and art critic Charles Baudelaire, and he was no friend of sculpture. He thought sculpture had many disadvantages to other art forms, such as painting. Baudelaire didn't like how a sculpture changed the way it was looking under different light forms. It was largely dependent on the light in which you place it. In a painting, you can render atmospheric effects, for example, but you can't sculpt them. He didn't like the viewer's ability to look at a sculpture from several different angles, rather than have the artist direct the viewer's gaze, the way painting does. Of course, we all know this is all comparing apples to oranges, right? Baudelaire just wasn't interested in what sculpture offered the viewer on its own merits, right? Especially in relation to painting. Sculpture was not Baudelaire's cup of tea. But that didn't stop Baudelaire from writing and publishing critiques on sculpture, especially sculpture which he encountered in the salons of Paris in the 1840s, in the 19th century. And the passage I just recited actually comes from his review of sculpture in the Paris Salon of 1846, to which he gave the title, Pourquoi la sculpture est ennuyeuse, or Why Sculpture is Boring. Now, despite, or maybe even perhaps because of his fundamental disinterest in his subject, he was unafraid to be blunt. And in being so, his criticisms of the work presented in the salons of the 1840s was actually as honest as they were insulting. Among his honest criticisms, Baudelaire noted that sculpture of his day seemed to lack ambition and direction compared to earlier times, right? And he was right. Neoclassicism in sculpture had kind of dragged on for much longer into the 19th century than it had for painting, right? And painting had, turned to embrace the more emotional, expressionist, romantic period, much earlier than sculpture did. And so much of what was being sculpted was either a regurgitation of older neoclassical genres and forms, or unambitious genre pieces, or works that were, at most, technically proficient, but weren't really saying anything, right? For the moment, at that time, sculpture seemed to hasn't lost its direction, right? And I think that there's actually a growing sense today that we are in a bit of a similar state. Maybe we're a bit repetitive, a bit unambitious. Pretty, we can do pretty sculptures. We can make well-made sculptures. And I'm not picking on people who put hoops in their sculptures here, right? I could have just as easily done a Google image search for, nude figure on rocks, right? Or torso, right? It's just that, these repetitive themes and genres are out there. And they're not everything in sculpture. By no means is this all we ever do. It's not indicative of everything going on in figurative sculpture today, but I think the scope and power of sculpture today, taken as a whole, would seem to be just much less than what it used to be. We would consider ourselves lucky, I think, to have the talents of James Pradier amongst us. Today, there are many sculptors who can render the figure well, but to me it seems that few of us really care to take those skills and talents beyond decorative work. Now, perhaps we haven't spent as much time learning why to sculpt as much as we've spent learning how to sculpt. Our work isn't much of a contributor today to the social, cultural conversation. It rarely seems like we have much to say with our work, or perhaps we're not saying it clearly enough. Now, to be sure, we can rise to the occasion, right? On the rare occasions that we are asked to, right? But usually someone else is asking us to rise to that occasion. That seems to be what it takes, right? Our most interesting work usually requires someone else to prompt us into creating ambitious or engaging sculpture, right? But we can be ambitious, such as with the World War I monument currently being sculpted by Sabin Howard. Pretty ambitious. And we can use our work to participate in and even encourage cultural conversation, such as with Kristen Visbal's Fearless Girl. And these two examples that I just shown are just the ones that have recently received the attention of the public, right? I have no doubt that many of us are making works with message and meaning and ambition that don't make the news. Maybe they never make it to a large scale, right? Maybe it goes into a gallery, or maybe it's just sitting on a shelf in your studio. It's a lot easier to engage the public when someone else is paying for that to happen, right? And it's not a small consideration with sizable works in bronze like the ones I've just shown, right? And sadly, these opportunities are few and far between. But it's not as bad as it used to be, right? There's a real difference between the state of figurative sculpture today and 40 or even 20 years ago, right? The atelier system of art education is on the rise in popularity. It has more visibility than it's ever had before. And there are more and better opportunities to study, and accordingly, there are more of us, and we are collectively getting better at it, right? We're slowly becoming more visible than in the very recent past. We're beginning to see the general public, if not the art establishment, show a bit of interest every now and then, right? This is all very good news. But all the same, figurative sculpture taken as a whole just isn't what it used to be, historically speaking, right? And most of you don't need me to tell you that, right? You don't need me to tell you some of the reasons why figurative sculpture isn't what it used to be, but I'm going to do it anyway. So you're going to have to humor me for a moment, all right? I'm going to run down just a short list of the main disadvantages which sculptors have to endure these days, right? And the first one, of course, is the biggie, the general societal shift from traditional fine arts precipitated by the merging of art with technology, right? It's maybe the biggest factor in the current state of the fine arts, this idea that technology has inherited from traditional painting and sculpture the crucial function of cultural participation, right? Telling stories, celebrating moments in cultural history, communicating values. Tech, it does it better with movies, with recorded music, television, the internet, all on demand and all for very little money. As much as you want, whenever you want, right? Because of technology, access to art of so many forms has just never been more affordable or more democratic. So how can traditional painting and sculpture compete? Frankly, it can't. It can't. And it's not just that popular interest has waned in what we do, but maybe it's less popular with those who help make sculpture possible. I'm talking about the grand patrons of centuries past that no longer exist today, right? Who is going to pay for our ambitious work? There are no kings or popes and whatnot, using painting and sculpture as propaganda, at least not on the scale they used to. I mean, maybe in a few dictatorships around the world, but not here yet. But do we really want to return to that time anyway? I mean, when you think about it, you got Pope Julius II or Louis XIV of France, right? They were some of the greatest, most influential patrons of sculpture, but their own personal taste or their own propagandistic needs decided the official taste of the power structures under their control. And that meant in those societies that if you didn't produce work aligned with that official taste, you pretty much didn't have a career in sculpture. The most ambitious work historically has been paid for by cultural dictators. Right? And now we live in a multicultural, pluralistic society, and that is a big improvement, right? In many ways, but not much has come along to replace the popes and absolute monarchs as underwriters of great masterpieces, right? We have corporations and other public governmental entities which commission art today, but they're pale shadows of the grand patrons of the past, right? Because rather than having a single monarch dictating taste, now it's taste by committee, right? which inevitably just dumbs down and waters down and removes all risks inherent in creating great work. And the last thing a corporation wants when purchasing art is a piece of work that says something. Corporations are buying your work as a tax write-off or as PR, right? Not because it wants to provoke or challenge. And then we have another thorn in our collective side, the state of the fine arts at its highest level as it exists today. Let's not forget those darn postmodernists and those conceptual artists, right? And their current stranglehold on the blue chip art market, right? Because just like the corporations and governments which buy art, the top tier dealers and collectors don't want work that actually makes a statement either, right? They don't want something that's immediately relevant to the culture. Because the more directly a piece of art speaks to people, the more likely it will eventually fall out of fashion or become dated. And often, this sort of art is nothing more than a financial instrument whose monetary value is directly tied to its fashionability. Having nothing to say never falls out of style. Silence is timeless, right? And it's too easy for the human figure to be loaded with meaning, right? So in this rarefied sphere of the art world, the figure is marginalized, unless, of course, it's dehumanized, right? As we see, when the figure is permitted at all, at the highest reaches of the fashionable artistic stratosphere, it's distorted or deconstructed or anonymized, as in the work of Antony Gormley or Botero. Some call it timeless. Others might call it non-committal. And if the prejudice against the human figure weren't enough, this influence and taste of the art market at the top of the food chain trickles down, not just into smaller markets, but into the schools and universities around the world. Art schools are desperate to have a successful alumnus or two that they can brag about in order to be seen as relevant and successful and to avoid getting their program cut, right? It's important. So university programs and related institutions, they toe the party line of what is in and what is out according to the top gallerists around the world. The system perpetuates itself. And that's why we've been subjected to a regurgitation of postmodern and conceptual art for over 50 years. It's no coincidence. Woe is us. Poor figurative sculptors, right? The public, the market, the patrons, and the schools, they're all against us. They all think we're useless. And until something changes, our fate is a fairly desperate one, right? And I've not told you anything you didn't already know. These are the complaints I've been hearing from sculptors and have been repeating myself for over 20 years, right? But in that 20 years, I have thrown myself a bit into studying the history of art, and it's helped me to more clearly see all the advantages sculptors had in the past that which today we do not enjoy, right? And there's even more stacked against us that I haven't even mentioned. There's more. But unlike those other calamities, which I have mentioned, these additional issues are issues sculptors themselves have the power to address and to change and overcome. And some of these hindrances are, in fact, largely of our own making. So today, I want to start a conversation about what we can do, what today we have the power to do to affect positive change in the quality, in the market, and more broadly, in the relevance of representational and traditional sculpture. And I want to start with a simple image. It's actually a logo. This is the logo for the very first art school in Europe. It was called the Accademia delle Arti del Disegno, the Academy of the Art of Disegno. Disegno is a tricky word. Disegno means drawing, but it also means design. It's one and the same word. The Italian mind does not separate those two ideas, which is fascinating. It made it similar to the word draftsmanship, kind of. But anyway, the logo is 3 rings of laurels, and they represent the 3 sister arts. And they're united by disegno. 3 sister arts united by draftsmanship, by drawing. It's painting, sculpture, and architecture. 3 equal and interlinked arts. Well, if we were to redesign the logo of the Accademia delle Arti del Disegno to reflect maybe today's current state of things, what would it look like? I think it would look something like this. Now, which of the three arts dominates over the other two in today's culture? Architecture, yeah, of course, yeah. Everyone is, oh yeah, duh, they have jobs. Of course it's architecture. You know, we need to live and work in buildings, right? In the most pragmatic sense, we don't need painting and sculpture. And many people get on fine without it, but we need shelter, right? And not only is the output of architects necessary, the profession itself commands a general respect from our culture, similar to the respect afforded doctors or judges, sometimes lawyers, right? And it's worth noting that the importance of architecture has been recognized for a long, long time. It's not that architecture got big, it's that painting and sculpture got small, right? But back in the day, the logo for the Accademia delle Arti del Disegno was not just a feel-good platitude, you know, pretending for the sake of politeness that we're all on the same team and we're all equal. No, that's actually how people regarded the fine arts, right? In the early Renaissance, architecture was a profession barely separate from the realm of painters and sculptors. Architecture, in fact, was kind of a side gig for a lot of great artists in the Renaissance, from Giotto to Michelangelo and many others. All three sister arts were united and interdependent. Even right up into the 19th century, we see mutual respect between the three sister arts, manifesting in the professional relationship between Augustus St. Gaudens and the architect Stanford White, who not only designed pedestals for St. Gaudens monuments, but Stanford White designed picture frames for St. Gaudens reliefs. Imagine the country's top architect designing our pedestals and picture frames for one of us. Imagine that. Hard to. Stanford White, as most of you probably already know, he was actually a founding member of the NSS. Such was his respect for sculpture and his interest in promoting it. He was far from the only architect member of the NSS. But I wonder how much that happens anymore. And here we are at the annual conference of the National Sculpture Society. And if you could raise your hand if you were a licensed and practicing architect in the room.
I married one.
Doesn't count. And where is he?
Chicago.
Well, there you go, priorities. So let the record show that 0 hands were raised. So what happened? What happened, and why does it matter? Where did the love go between the arts of sculpture and architecture? Well, it's an interesting story. The desire of architects to strip their buildings of sculptural work, and indeed of any sort of ornament at all, had its roots in the same social pressures that produced the City Beautiful movement. The City Beautiful movement in the late 19th century, as you know, was an effort on the part of city planners and architects and politicians and artists to use beauty as a social engineering tool. All right, so the idea went that building a beautiful, monumental cityscape would create a sense of moral, civic pride, a civic virtue, amongst its residents. There would be less crime, less violence in such a city, right? The common man would be moved to improve himself if he was just merely exposed to notions of the ideal represented in art and architecture. But at the same time, there were some other would-be social engineers that complained that the practitioners of the City Beautiful movement were too focused on aesthetics, and that the idea that by simply filling a city with pretty allegorical statues and classical architecture would lead to moral improvement of the lower classes, well, that idea itself is classist and, frankly, quite naive. Now, in opposition to the City Beautiful movement, we find architects like the Austrian Adolf Loos, who, in his manifesto from 1913, entitled Ornament and Crime, stated that ornamenting everyday objects from buildings to furniture to cutlery is actually an offense against the lower classes, because styles of ornament, like all fashion, was temporary. And this adherence to fashion caused otherwise useful objects in our daily life to be seen as outmoded and in need of replacement. And so by stripping objects of ornament down to their utilitarian forms, they would become, in a sense, timeless, right? And serve the needs of the people using them for longer, without causing the user to be seen as behind the times or unfashionable or of a lower social class. Indeed, Adolf Loos thought of ornament itself as a moral failing, calling it degenerate, and he proclaimed that the lack of ornamentation is a sign of spiritual strength. maybe going a bit far. But architects like Luz thought that having no ornament would improve the standard of living of the lower classes more than the aesthetics of the City Beautiful movement. And so a century ago, we find two opposing aesthetic movements in architecture with the same goal of improving society. And of course, we know who won out, right? It was the would-be social engineers in Adolf Luz's camp, right? The phrase coined by the architect Louis Sullivan, form follows function, was widely misinterpreted to imply stark utilitarianism. And as buildings lost their organic decorative flourishes and became more starkly abstract and geometric, the philosophies behind this aesthetic grew to be dehumanizing. Le Corbusier, the famous architect, the infamous architect, who popularized high-rise apartment blocks which were designed to contain the greatest amount of people in the smallest possible space, referred to his structures as machines for living. Le Corbusier himself referred to ornament and decoration as a perversion and said that the more a people are cultivated, the more decor disappears. I could go on, but suffice it to say that once this idea that ornament and decoration was a moral failing, once that took hold, that it was a sign of degeneracy, sculptors and architects divorced. And here we are 5 generations down the road. Sculptors and architects have very largely lost whatever connections they had enjoyed for the previous 2 millennia. Why is that important? Well, most great works of sculpture were architectural in nature. Most old masters made their names and fortunes in this way. Many sculptors made livings by ornamenting buildings or supplemented their careers with it. It's always been a substantial chunk of any sculptor's career, right? And when sculpture lost architecture, we lost not just a crucial source of revenue, but we lost the path to truly ambitious work. Michelangelo's David was part of an architectural scheme to decorate the Duomo of Florence, right? And he was hired by an architect, the architect of the Duomo, not a bishop, not a Grand Duke, an architect. Bernini hardly has any work not associated directly with the architecture of churches and monuments and public spaces. And again, these commissions generally came not through popes and dukes directly, but through architects working for popes and dukes. So not all great masterpieces of sculpture were architecturally driven, but many of the most ambitious, certainly some of the most expensive, and the most progressive ones were. The Gates of Hell by Rodin, architectural. I've already mentioned Michelangelo's David, architectural commission. Four Rivers Fountain by Bernini, hired by an architect. Carpeau's Dance on the facade of the Paris Opera. I think we've heard a little bit about him today. Daniel Chester French, his Lincoln. Actually, we heard this morning how French was chosen by the architect. Now, while the funding for each of these masterpieces come from ruling bodies, the selection of artists was often in the hands of the architects. But none of these masterpieces would have been built at all had architects of that day derided and rejected sculptural ornamentation the way they have done in the 20th century. Historically, it's the architects that convinced the clients to spend that kind of money on ornamentation. Now, if the architects are not on our side, the sculpture doesn't get made. And beyond being simply the stage for great masterpieces, as I mentioned, architecture also provided many sculptors with work, making ornament and embellishment for facades and interiors. And in fact, before the advent of the commercial art galleries in the 19th century, this was the most reliable means of income for sculptors, and it had been for centuries. Now today, the only people doing architectural ornamentation are commercial firms engaged in historical reproduction or restoration. But the problem is much larger than just a lost stream of revenue for sculptors. It's much larger. Let's go back to the logo for the Accademia del Disegno. The three sister arts, as I mentioned, are shown linked, right? And it's not just that painting, sculpture, and architecture share the art of drawing amongst them. It's that their very fates are intertwined. All three are stronger when all three proceed together. And as it happens, architecture is and always has been the linchpin, the keystone, because everyone experiences architecture, as everyone must. Architecture is the true interface between the public and the arts. And I mean the real public, all right? Because the only people who go to galleries are gallery goers. The only people who go to museums are museum goers. And as we all know, that's a tiny fraction of the real, true public, the real populace, right? But everyone goes outside once in a while. Everyone walks or drives by buildings and they look at them and they have their favorites and they have the ones they hate, and regardless of whether or not they know anything at all about sculpture, or I'm sorry, architecture. But if that architecture is ornamented, then the same thing happens with sculpture. The public becomes familiar with it, and people react to it and react with it. I won't go as far as the City Beautiful people and say that, art in public places automatically elevates the moral climate of the culture, but everyone, I can say that people take notice of their surroundings and are affected by it and have opinions about it and seek out what they like. And when you live in a city full of public art, as I do in Florence, or as you do in New York if you're from New York, everyone, the cab drivers, the nannies, the politicians, sanitation workers, everyone develops a little bit of an opinion or maybe just a sense, maybe even just a taste for sculpture, because people at least know what they like and what they don't, right? Everyone does that. But you have to be exposed to it. You only develop that taste when you're exposed to sculpture. And most people won't seek out sculpture. But if you live in a city that decorates its architecture and public places, you don't have to. You don't have to seek it out. And once you have the exposure, you may develop a taste. Once you have the taste, you may come to at least an appreciation for what art can add to people's lives, and you may start to value it. I don't think I can overstate the importance this public interface of architecture has to the fate and fortunes of her sister arts. But I can offer some evidence for the power of architecture as a conduit between the other arts and the public. For your consideration, I give you the most well-known living artist in the world, an artist with a household name which is truly global, who uses the facades of buildings to display his art, and whose fame can be substantially attributed to that fact. Banksy. But whether you love him or hate him, that's actually irrelevant. You know him. Had Banksy decided to exhibit his works in a gallery, you never would have heard of him. Never would have heard of him. Guarantee it. His career is proof of the power of architecture as a vehicle for the arts. And Banksy hijacked that power, or rather, he merely took up the power that architects and sculptors had abandoned. That power was there for the taking. Now, graffiti has been around as long as architecture has. Is it really just coincidence that for the first time in history, graffiti has risen to the level of art precisely at the same time when, for the first time in history, sculpture and architecture have been divorced? Coincidence? I don't know. And perhaps you think Banksy is kind of a bad comparison, or at least an irrelevant one, right, to architectural decoration, right? After all, what Banksy does is protest the status quo, and historically, architectural decoration, if anything, promotes and supports the status quo. Architectural sculpture was bought and paid for by those in power. And while Banksy, what he does, that's illegal.
Architectural decoration and public sculpture in general are a mouthpiece for those in power, the ruling government, the dominant culture, what have you. So it's a projection of those powers. It's not a protest against that power. Well, my point of using Banksy as an example is not that we should all be cultural rebels telling truth to power, although I should also say that at least some of us definitely should take on that role. My point is that Banksy and other street artists have successfully used architecture in the way we sculptors used to, but now don't. But the best of the street artists, like Banksy, not only use the platform we no longer use,
they use it to exhibit art which speaks directly to the contemporary public, right? The best art gives voice to ideas that are current in our culture. They address topics relevant to the people of our times. And historically, figurative sculpture has also served this role. We might not think of it as that, but it has. Both as a vehicle for social criticism, like Banksy, or also as a voice of the ideas and aspirations of a people. right? Sculptors can use that voice in the way that Michelangelo and Donatello and Verrocchio did in making statues of the shepherd boy David, who slew the giant Goliath. Right? David was symbolic of the small independent city-state of Florence, which was surrounded and constantly challenged by the giants of the Pope in Rome, the kings of France and Spain, Venice, Lombardy, and so on. And the statues of David littering Florence are, in reality, statues of the spirit of Florence in a certain time and place. We can also look at the way that Jules Deleuze addressed his culture when depicting the common working man, celebrating the humanity of the laborer in an era of increasing industrialization. Or we can take a look at the American Hiram Powers, who created a hugely powerful symbol of the abolitionist cause in the years leading up to the Civil War, a statue of a Greek girl held captive by the Turks. Right? It's a statue which both elicited sympathy for the poor white European held captive by the heathens, while highlighting the hypocrisy that allowed for such a sentiment in a culture which itself perpetuated slavery. This was the single most popular American sculpture of the 19th century. So being relevant in your culture doesn't automatically mean being rebellious to it, but it is in cultural commentary where public art often finds its highest purpose. Now, the question of cultural message aside, maybe you still think Banksy's a bad role model because what he does is risky. You run the risk of being locked up for what this guy does, right? And also, if you think about making guerrilla sculpture and clandestinely decorating a building with your sculpture, who's going to pay for it, right? The materiality of sculpture is more than just a few cans of spray paint. And what if it gets confiscated or stolen? These are all valid points. This is definitely not a sound business plan. But then again, maybe we should consider and remember Arturo de Modica, the sculptor of the work known as the Charging Bull, or more commonly, the Wall Street Bull. De Modica spent his own money to make it, and he installed it without permission on Wall Street in 1989 in the middle of the night as a symbol of American economic strength during a time of economic crisis. It's another example of a sculptor creating a work that resonates with its time and place. Right? Of course, that didn't stop it from being, removed and impounded later that same day, but not before it attracted a lot of attention from thousands of New Yorkers, many of whom worked in the financial district, and who clamored for the work to be returned, which it was. It was returned to the public space in a week's time. And it has become a New York icon, and an icon of Wall Street, to be revered or loathed, depending on what you think of contemporary capitalist society. The Charging Bull, for me, is one example of a sculptor giving the people what they want before they even know they want it. And it's people like Arturo de Modica, I think, that would agree with me, or agree with one of my favorite mottos, that it's easier to receive forgiveness than it is to receive permission. But again, if we sculptors take this sort of initiative, who's going to pay for it? De Modica spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to make that bull. It was a huge risk. You may have the best idea in the world, but without a patron to fund it, it might never be realized. And as I've already mentioned, we live in a pluralistic, multicultural democracy, and so there's no popes, no kings, just we the people. The people are in power in our society, so we're told. So maybe that's who will fund the public masterpieces of the next generation, the public. Crowdfunding platforms like Kickstarter and GoFundMe and Patreon have revolutionized the way capital is raised by small and independent entrepreneurs and artists around the world. It is now common for small independent bands or theater companies to launch campaigns to fund their next album or production, right? The fundamental law of crowdsourcing seems to be that you must capture the attention and the imagination of the public in order to be successful. All that's needed is a good idea that resonates or that people see as important. Let's pause and reflect on that. Imagine, instead of having to cater to the whims of a pope or a king, or in our own day, a corporation or municipality, funding is awarded based on the merit of your ideas and the strength of your skill as judged by the people who will eventually view that art. Public art, the public wants. That it wants badly enough to contribute money towards. Good ideas get made, Ones that don't hold up to scrutiny, they don't. This model could well be the grand patron of a pluralistic democracy. And of course, this is nothing new. Crowdfunding is practically an American tradition. The pedestal for the Statue of Liberty was raised by crowdfunding. In 1885, Joseph Pulitzer, his newspaper, the New York World, ran a fundraising campaign targeted to working class Americans. And he promised to publish in his newspaper the name of every person who donated, no matter how small the amount. Right? And beyond that, any donation of $1, you get a little 6-inch replica of the Statue of Liberty. If you donate $5, you get a 12-inch statue. And within 6 months, over 120,000 people had donated over $100,000, which in today's money would be $3.4 million. Most donations were under $1. And similar campaigns were helped to fund Mount Rushmore. Right? So though crowdfunding is what we call it now, the idea of raising funds for ambitious works through subscription, which is what they called it then, it's an idea that's been around for a while. And it usually involved civic groups and nonprofits and organizations of all sorts, to do all the footwork and administration. But now, thanks to internet crowdfunding, we just do it ourselves, right? Painters and sculptors are starting to use these resources. I've seen a couple, but I'm surprised that it really isn't being more regularly employed by sculptors, the way music groups and performing arts groups do. And I think we need to make this idea more familiar to the public, that the beautification of their public space is something that they can readily and effectively contribute to. But back to the larger point of architecture, right? Back to that original issue, that architects don't seem to want adornment on their buildings. Well, that continues to be largely true. But just as the pendulum has swung back towards the public's interest in representational art somewhat in recent years, might we start to see architects harboring similar thoughts and impulses? After decades of the void, might we start to see architectural sculpture arise ex nihilo? We can point to institutions like the ICAA, right here in New York, the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art, based here in New York with chapters around the United States. Dozens of professional firms who actively practice traditional architecture are represented in its membership. Notice what their logo is. It's not a piece of architecture, it's a sculpture, right? That should give us a little bit of hope. Augusta St. Gaudens Diana, in case you were wondering. Now the ICAA, they offer workshops and seminars and a summer intensive program geared for architects, but also designers and related professionals. And these are courses which teach a sculptor wishing to break into architectural ornamentation what they would need to know. And I'm unsure if there's any sort of dialogue between the NSS and the ICAA, but I can imagine that such a connection, if it were not already present, would be one well worth making. We can also look at, for another glimmer of hope, we can look at the Percent for Art programs. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, maybe, probably personally, right? The famous Percent for Art programs around the country, which, it's funding legislation enacted by the federal government as well as many cities and states. And it mandates that in the budget for any public building project, 1% of the estimated cost of the work gets set aside for public art. The Percent for Art program started in the 60s and arose specifically to foster a more pleasing public cityscape, at least more pleasing than contemporary architects apparently thought necessary. Now, this is the best thing to happen to the relationship between architects and sculptors in decades, right? No. I think it's the worst thing to happen to us. Because written into many of the guidelines for the various Percent for Art programs around the United States is the stipulation that the artwork be selected by the wonderful committees, which are formed of independent panels of experts, usually including the architects, but as a minority voice. And crucially, these artists and artworks are selected after the building has been designed. And this means, I presume, that any architectural embellishment or ornamentation that the architect wishes to include would have to come out of his remaining 99%, right? It thus diminishes the probability of architectural embellishment, making it into the project at the design stage, as these competitions for the sculpture, for the public art, happen after the fact. It eliminates the possibility of free collaboration between the architect and the artists of his or her own choosing. Ironically, unadorned buildings, of course, were the catalyst for the Percent for Art programs to be widely adopted throughout the United States. But far from encouraging architects to design ornamented buildings, they ensure it will not happen. I mean, if I wanted to design a program specifically to antagonize the relationship between architects and sculptors, I'd probably come up with a program very similar to the Percent for Art program. And, this thing. We're in New York, you guys familiar with this? Has it gone up yet? Yeah, so this is a winning design for a Percent for Art project for Long Island City, which received such a public outcry that Percent for Art laws in New York are being reviewed and possibly altered to include more input from the public, the people who are paying for it in the first place. Now imagine what a Percent for Art program could be, right? What if architects for public buildings were still required to spend 1% on art, as they are now, but had the option to bring in the artists at the design level to ensure a cohesive and intelligible work? What if they had the option to design a more beautiful building at the outset, rather than having their completed work plastered with an artwork that is, at best, irrelevant to his design, his or her design? I think any organization of sculptors would benefit greatly if they made an effort to form a unified front with any and all architectural organizations and institutions of a similar mind, not just with the ICAA, but with professional firms and maybe universities, other private schools, with the goal to lobby to change the way Percent for Art programs are instituted. Architects should be given the option and should be encouraged to form collaborations with the artists tacked with the embellishment of their structures. Public architectural art should have the chance to be more than an afterthought. By the way, for this slide, it's a nice slide, I would have loved to include here an image of a contemporary public architecture which employed architectural embellishment. I couldn't find any. So there you go. But that reconnection between architects and sculptors won't be easy. It's not just a matter of an architect deciding to utilize sculptors, because the sad truth of it is, it wasn't just the architects that turned away from sculpture. It was also a case of sculptors turning their backs to architecture and the arts of architectural adornment. We as sculptors no longer know what we need to know. We're no longer fluent in the language of architecture. We no longer know what architects need us to know. If an architect wanted to seek out a young up-and-comer from any of our finest institutions, our ateliers, anywhere from around the world, which teach traditional, figurative, and representational work, that architect would walk away empty-handed, because just like the contemporary postmodernist art schools, which train students in response to the blue-chip art market, we too orient our training towards our art markets, namely the commercial art galleries. All right, now our sculpture ateliers are perfect if your goal as a sculptor is to produce cute little bronze nudes. Right? It's what commercial art galleries can sell the most of, so it's exactly what we have trained ourselves to make. Even the best ateliers for sculpture today do not offer much training beyond how to draw, how to model a figure in clay, how to cast it. That's just about it. I had to use a photo of my own class, to be fair, because this is also what I teach, right? Because, of course, the figure is the foundation of the craft. But how many of us never take it much farther than the reproduction of well-rendered but anonymous nudes? We don't learn many of the basics, which were offered in the schools of the past. Things like carving in wood or stone, the language of ornamentation, architectural ceramics, architectural orders. We don't even learn the basic vocabulary of architecture. We don't learn model enlargement, the principles of design, all these skills that would be useful when working for architects, right? But all of these were taught at the École des Beaux-Arts and elsewhere in the 19th century. But we seem to forget that when we tell our students what a historically accurate Beaux-Arts training they're getting. A bronze nude is one of the last things you will find adorning architecture because of its comparative cost, its weight, its nudity. right? We even teach ourselves that ornamental and decorative sculpture are in a class below that of the figurative sculptor. You know, figures are art, but decoration is a trade. Figure work might be the best that we can do and the best we can aspire to. But to limit ourselves to what sells in the local art gallery is to limit ourselves in a way past masters never did. And it is to represent our art to the public as being little more than bourgeois kitsch decoration. It appears disconnected from the wants and the needs of the public, as we sometimes accuse postmodernist and conceptual artists as being. The way in which we have limited our education in sculpture affects our relationship to architecture, and it limits our relationship to the larger culture as well. But it's not just that we're ignorant of architecture. We seem to be ignorant of sculpture's cultural storytelling potential. We seem to be collectively uninterested in narrative content in our work. Or if we are interested, we are unfamiliar with how to do it well. Now, I've mentioned that, I mentioned before, we no longer tell the stories of our popular cultures. We leave that to the movies. But we sculptors actually gave up that role as storyteller before movies were broadly available, before television was invented, in fact. Starting more than a century ago, we actually chose to make ourselves irrelevant to the popular culture by refusing to use our work to talk about what is important to us. How did that happen? And why? Why did we decide to turn our backs to interacting with our contemporary culture? Well, it starts with Rodin. Rodin, you may have heard of him, recognized as one of the gods of sculpture in the pantheon of creativity next to Michelangelo and Bernini, right? One of the reasons he is so considered is because Rodin expanded the scope of what sculpture could be in a way that no sculptor before him ever did. Rodin was the first sculptor to successfully throw off all conventions and context of the human form, right? And present the human figure just on its own terms, a meditation on human flesh for its own sake. He stripped the figure of all identity, narrative, symbolism, allegory, and even humanity. I mean, consider the walking man. Who is this figure? There's no identity, there's no context here. This isn't part of a narrative. Is this nameless figure even alive? How can he be? He has no head. But at the same time, he's on his feet and walking. So we're sort of forced to accept this rendering of flesh on no other terms than those presented. It's symbolic of nothing. It represents nothing. It only presents human flesh, the carnality of our physical selves, to be examined without the bias of culture or context. And it's a truly groundbreaking work of art. And it's one of the worst things to happen to art, to figurative art as well. Because while stripping sculpture of all historical conventions was an intellectual leap in sculpture, it also gave license to lazy sculptors, and sculptors who were short on ideas. You could just bypass much of what sculpture traditionally did, which was tell stories and give meaning and present ideas in human form. Rodin made it acceptable to have no stories to tell, no lofty concepts to promote, no ideas at all. All you needed to do was to make a figure and cast it, and then it could just stand on its own merits without the baggage of content. And figures without content, coincidentally, are exactly what galleries can sell best, right? Because if a work means nothing, how can it offend? A work which is pretty and devoid of meaning or opinion is the most saleable commodity in an art gallery. And as soon as you make a choice, or take a stand, invoke a narrative, you limit your potential buying audience, and hey, we need all the help we can get. So we stay silent and pretty and inoffensive. And speaking of lazy, nowadays, you don't even have to make a whole figure, do you? You can just, leave the hard parts out, right? Like heads and hands and feet, torso, a fragment. Thanks once again to Rodin. Before Rodin, no one made torso fragments intentionally. That's a new genre with Rodin, a new genre in figurative sculpture. But it's become ubiquitous. It feels like it's always been around, right? Doesn't it? Creating a torso fragment is a basic part of the curriculum of many of our ateliers and schools. You can take workshops on how to sculpt a torso. I'd like to take a workshop that teaches me why to sculpt a torso. Because after 20 years of modeling figures, I still have no idea why I would bother, beyond just a purely decorative motif. And there's nothing wrong with decoration. But decorative nudes, and decorative parts of nudes, seems to be all we do anymore. It's our self-imposed limitation. And it's been that way for so long that it seems as though, from our contemporary perspective, that's just always been that way. I mean, I was studying art history for years. I had become pretty well versed in art history before I could start to understand this very, very particular sort of rut we are all in. Most of us, I should say. The nude, decontextualized body as the beginning and end of figurative art is the dominant paradigm with us today, right? Our time is going to be remembered by art history as one of the longer periods of regressive mannerism in figurative sculpture since maybe the medieval period, right? Call it Rodinerism. Call it Rodin Rococo. I don't know, but that's where we are. Now, some of us may put our pretty nudes in frames, or in hoops, or just to do something different. Some of us might put our figures and possibly cantilevered off their bases, so the figure seems to float or fly or fall. Some of us may even hire contortionists because we've run out of all the poses normal people can do. But what we don't do is convey an opinion, a story, an identity. What we don't do is talk about ourselves the way that movies do, and music does, and literature does, and every other art form that is culturally popular. And I think the current generation of young sculptors intuit this lack of content, this avoidance of telling stories, this, getting away from identity or stating opinions. And they want to push back against it in some way, but the problem is that they don't have much guidance as to how that's done, because none of their teachers saw actual content as a priority. They were too busy concerned with the body as narrative, sort of thing, just rehashing Rodin, right? And so the younger generation of sculptors finds itself making works like this, right? Expressive, isn't it? Evocative, isn't it? Well, expressive of what? Evocative of what? What is it actually expressing? We've all seen 100 heads and 100 figures, just like this, a figure in the midst of some undefined passion, but why? What's the source of the passion? So, maybe we'll look to the title for clues, right? And we find that the title is just as evocative as the sculpture, right? Because heads like these always have to have the big, vague, multisyllabic words as titles to give the impression that the sculpture is actually saying something, but what it's saying is just out of the reach of your comprehension. Now, this head could be just as evocatively called ellipsis, or metamorphosis, or transcendence, or pulchritude, or solitude, or catharsis, or antithesis, or syllabus, right? Now, or, parenthesis. Does anyone know what parenthesis means? Anyone at all? Oh, maybe someone can Google it and tell us in the Q&A, which is coming up in just like 2 minutes. I'm almost done here, guys. But what this work doesn't do, again, is convey an opinion, a story, an identity. It only expresses the urge to express, right? What we don't do when we make art like this is say something other people can hear, right? The way movies do, and music does, and literature does, and every other art form does that's culturally relevant or culturally popular, right? Now I want to stress that there's plenty of room for the sculptors who want to render the human figure for its own sake, and there are dozens of fantastic works out there that I love that do nothing more than just present a figure. But I also think there is room for sculpture that speaks out, that poses a question, that tells a story, takes a point of view. And that is largely missing today. And it's been missing for so long, we don't notice its absence. And personally, I find it disturbing that some of the more interesting and engaging and challenging sculpture today, like this Matilda statue here, or like the Fearless Girl in front of the Charging Bull, they were conceived not by the sculptors who made them, but by advertising and PR firms. A marketing executive thought them up and then hired one of us to bring those ideas to fruition. Are we really less creative and more risk-adverse than corporate PR firms? Do we really bother to say something only when we're getting paid to, and then only say what we're paid to say? If this doesn't make you a little concerned or ashamed maybe, then perhaps this entire talk isn't directed at you, and that's fine, because it's not a path all of us should take, but it's a path some of us should take. And to those sculptors who are looking for a way forward, my advice is to take risks and make connections, all right? You want to take risks in your sculpture by taking a point of view, telling a story, committing to an opinion, make a connection with your audience. But also take risks with your sculpture. Get it out to people who can see it. Get it out to where people can see it. Don't cling to the gallery system, frankly. I think it's broken. Galleries serve a clientele, not the public, right? Their agenda does not match yours, and it never will. Make connections to the real public, which includes people that don't like art, and people who disagree with your opinion. It's hard to make it as an artist. Just attempting to make a living this way is a risky proposition in itself, but once you've decided to risk becoming an artist, you need to go further and take risks as an artist. And that's how the masterpieces get made. Thank you.